Surina Taneja, I quit full-time medicine, career reflections.
It has been 4 months since I quit my full-time job as a doctor, and still, even as I say that, there are alarm bells ringing in my head like, what are you doing? You literally worked so hard for the pleasure of working this very specific career.
Sunk cost fallacy, baby!
I feel like most things in life follow the whole grass is greener rhetoric, where whatever you're doing doesn't seem as desirable or exciting as what the other side is doing. So I think it's worth having conversations about both sides of the story. I just like thinking out loud and talking to you guys about the journey, and it allows me to put off getting actual therapy for a little bit longer, so let's just keep going. I qualified as a doctor around 3 years ago, and I did 2 years of the foundation program, which is the first 2 years of your training. Then, instead of applying for specialty training as you can do at that stage, I sidestepped off the career progression ladder and did a non-training job in Australia. And after about a year of that, I sidestepped off the career ladder even more and have actually not decided to go for any job this year, be it training or non-training, and so I'm currently unemployed from full-time work.
Unemployed, aka entrepreneur. Use that on your dating app.
2 words: entrepreneurship. Being broke is a mindset.
I have been doing ad hoc locum shifts along the way to earn some money and be able to afford hot chocolates. So if you've ever heard anyone talk about a career path in medicine, you know it's often described as a sort of conveyor belt analogy, in that it's a very linear, well-trodden, predefined, almost self-moving career path that kind of drags you along with it. It doesn't mean it's a totally passive effort from yourself, like you have to keep your competencies up, keep your portfolio, and be doing interviews and exams along the way to make sure that you can progress to the next step. But what the next step is very clearly defined. So the conveyor belt looks something like...
I think the phrasing of conveyor belt has somewhat of a negative connotation, but for those who are familiar with chaos theory, as humans, we don't like to admit how uncertain the world is, right? And having that level of certainty and organization and structure to your career progression, I think is actually a big reason why a lot of people go into medicine, because they know if they do X, Y, and Z and they put in X number of years, sure, you got to work hard, but you know that at the end, this is what your life looks like, this is what your career looks like. I think it's, for most people, actually an upside rather than a downside. And if it is a problem for you, the good news is that many, many people before you have taken more agency and not just followed the prescribed training path, but have done different things. Of course, Surina being one of those people, me being one of those people, and many, many others.
Graduating from medical school, doing your 2 years of foundation training, then applying for specialty training and being a specialty trainee for however many years that program is, and then ending up as a consultant on the other end.
And for those who don't know, consultant on the other side of the pond is the same as attending physician here in the US.
I left that conveyor belt about a year and a half ago now, and with every passing day that gap is getting longer and longer. And sometimes I just think about it like, what are you doing? I think this is why I loved being in Australia so much, because obviously I was surrounded by lots of other UK trained doctors who had stepped off the career path, so it felt like you were kind of doing what everyone else is doing.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that going to Australia is a common thing for UK doctors who want to sidestep the regular training path. Here in the US, I'm not sure if it's a matter of geography or more just 2024 versus prior years, but it seems like now many more people are considering this opportunity. And it may be that it's the same number of people, but we just have so much more visibility now because of social media. And even in the early years of social media, people weren't really open about this if they did make this decision. I think that my video about quitting plastic surgery residency was one of the early ones. And in more recent years, we see a lot more. But keep in mind, even before social media, people were leaving clinical medicine and not following this traditional path. I know even in plastics, I would hear at the various programs I was rotating at that, oh yeah, we had a PGY 3 or 4 or whoever that left and did consulting at McKinsey or BCG or whatever. So I wish we had some solid data regarding whether it is or is not getting more common. But it's cool that UK trainees have Australia as a common place where this does occur. In the US, I'm not sure if we have something similar.
But regardless, I still want to be a surgeon, and progression in surgery particularly, I think it's really easy to see what progression looks like when you're working with colleagues who have been training for a few years in that speciality, and they're independently doing things in theatre and very tangibly and visibly upskilling. And I'm watching them like, but I want that. And I chose not to go and get it. So that's a bit confusing. It's a bit of a conundrum to battle with sometimes.
You can do anything, but you can't do everything. Even Johnny Kim, right? The people making memes about him, the Navy SEAL Dr. Astronaut. You're doing one thing at a time. You can't, I want to be a race car driver and an astronaut and a surgeon. I can't do all those things all at once. And even doing them chronologically is really challenging, which is why it's so impressive what Johnny Kim has done. But I think acknowledging that you can do anything, but you can't do everything has given me at least some peace, because I did love plastic surgery. I did love entrepreneurship. And realizing that no human can do all these things concurrently, at least not in a way that I find appealing, because I still do want to focus on my health, my sleep, my exercise. That gives you a little bit of peace.
With UK surgical training, there are two methods of infiltrating the training pathways. One is the normal surgical training that pretty much anyone who wants to do surgery has to apply for. And the other is the academic surgical training pathway, where there's obviously more of a focus on research, academia generally, and that is a separate method of application. But it's hard to explain when you're not in the system. You're just not as aware of the timeframes and periods of time when things should be opening and you should be starting to think about applications. You're just not really in that frame of mind yourself. Secondly, when I did get around to filling out these application forms, I realized that I needed quite a few references. I think I needed 3 consultant references. And again, when you're working, when you're in the system, that's not a problem. You ask your assigned supervisors, consultants you are currently working with or have worked with for a good period of time. But when you don't have a regular team, rotations, supervisors, and you're very much on your own, it can be a little difficult. I just remember very awkwardly emailing consultants I'd worked with months and months ago, even as far back as when I was last in the UK, almost 2 years ago, because that was the last consultant who'd supervised me for a proper research project, and so was the best person to be my academic supervisor.
This is relevant for those who are in the US even, right? If you're applying to medical school or you're applying to residency, you will need letters of recommendation. So if, let's say in your first or second year, you come across a professor who you would like to write a letter of recommendation for you, you have a couple options. One is that you stay in contact with them because hopefully you've built a relationship there. So this should feel kind of natural to maintain that contact, maintain the relationship so that when you do apply in a few years, you're not in this awkward situation that Surina's talking about. Alternatively, you can ask these people to write you letters of recommendation well before you actually apply to medical school or apply to residency. The benefit there, of course, being that the interaction is more fresh. They're likely going to write you a better letter of recommendation, and of course, they're more likely to say yes.
So when I was in medical school and working in the UK, you've learned a certain set of guidelines for how to deal with common presentations, which medications to give, which kind of treatment plans to follow. And yes, those are slightly changing, but you kind of pick it up as you're working. Now that I've been out the system for a couple of years, and I've come back to do these questions, which are based on UK guidelines, suddenly everything has changed. As I'm doing these questions, I'm answering them from what I know and from what I learnt, and then I'm so shocked when it's wrong because I know that's what I used to know. And it turns out all the guidelines have changed and I'm completely unaware of them because I haven't been working in a UK system for so long.
This is actually totally normal. They say that 50% of what you learn in medical school is wrong. You just don't know which 50% that is, which makes sense, right? We're learning so much. As a society, our medical knowledge is expanding at such a rate that, of course, much of what we thought was true a few years ago may be completely different today. To be a good physician, you need to be on top of the literature because things are changing at such a rapid pace, and you want to be able to provide your patients with the best care possible.
It's really made me appreciate how hard it must be for international graduates to sit these exams, which are so heavily based on UK guidelines specifically, because I'm suddenly feeling like such an outsider with my medical knowledge, which is such a weird feeling when you've trained here and learned everything from here in the first place. Okay, so this is the part where it's gonna get pretty real. It's been 4 months, as I may have mentioned, of not working as a full-time doctor, and I don't miss it at all.
I'm sure Surina's going to get to this, but keep in mind, when someone says that, you always need to consider, number one, their level of training. For whatever reason, on the other side of the pond, they say doctor when I think they should be saying junior doctor or whatever. Here in the US, we tend to be better about saying resident versus attending physician, right? And the second thing is the specialty. Those two are very much related because oftentimes if you are in training, you're not really focused on the specialty you want. She wants to do surgery. She's likely not doing surgery because she's still in training in her earlier years. So
firstly, I think it's important to look at the type of work I'm doing. It's not as simple as just saying I am a doctor. The kind of work that I can do is the work that I have been trained to do and that I have the relevant competencies signed off to do. That is what is safe, not only for the patients, but also for myself, to make sure I'm not putting myself in any compromising situations where I'm stepping up and taking more responsibility than I'm qualified to do. Now, since I haven't been progressing on any training programs, I'm kind of stuck at a level of doctoring that I have been at for a couple of years now. But essentially, I'm not doing the kind of work that I want to be doing.
So my understanding is that she did her first 2 years, so before specialization. So essentially, she's just working as an intern continuously, which sounds pretty not fun. And when you consider that, there's no surprise that she's not enjoying her job of doctoring, right? As a junior doctor, or whatever the technical term is.
In that I'm not getting trained surgically, I'm not having surgical competencies signed off, and for me to be able to own them and do them more independently and basically do everything that I want to be doing on a surgical training.
I'm obviously biased, but I also find surgical training, surgical procedures, working with your hands to be so much more rewarding than most other parts of medicine. And there's pros and cons that come with that, but I mean, one of the big cons being your lifestyle tends to be worse in surgery versus non-surgical specialties. But the other thing to keep in mind for those who are earlier on who are considering surgery is that you may consider surgeons to just be operating all day. That's not the truth. We do a lot of day in the life videos here. We do So You Want to Be on the Med School Insider channel. And you have to remember that as a surgeon, you're still doing clinic, you're still doing pre-op, post-op. It's not just being in the operating room and operating. But when you are in the OR and you are working with your hands, it is very much rewarding. And I found both that and racing my car to be the two things most likely to get me into a flow state.
And so the hope is that when I am on a training pathway, I will enjoy it more. Now, speaking to other doctors who have progressed and are on training programs, they do seem to be enjoying it a lot, in surgery specifically. And yes, there are all the trials and tribulations that come with working as a doctor, with working in the NHS. I know it's not easy right now. On the whole, they are enjoying stepping up and getting stuck into surgery. Now, like I mentioned, the reason I'm doing locum shifts this year is because I need money. I need money like we all do. It's a big year and savings alone will not cut it at all for me. So I gotta make that cash. The thing with a medical career, whether you're working full-time or locum shifts like I am now, is you are directly exchanging your time for money.
Active income versus passive income, which has been super overhyped in the last several years. And then people realize that to generate passive income, it takes a lot of work up front. And people think that, oh, if I do this YouTube thing or this content creation thing, this influencer thing, I'm going to have passive income. And it's like, well, no, the algorithm requires that you are regular with your uploads. Otherwise, your views and revenue just run off. And that's a whole other conversation.
I know people manage to fit lots of things in with a full-time job. It's not impossible by any means. At the same time, it's not the flexible and multifaceted life that I want to be living.
So keep in mind, when you hear people say that, oh, you can totally do these things as side hustles with a full-time job, most people who are working a full-time job outside of medicine are not working the number of hours and the unpredictability of those hours as those who are in medicine, right? Obviously, there are people in finance and some other fields that are working insane hours as well, but it's kind of an apples to oranges comparison when you're saying, you know, the person who's working 40, 45 hours a week, 8 to 5, they have a side hustle, very different than someone in medicine, not only because of the hours worked, but if you're on call, if your schedule is changing day to day, that becomes so much more challenging. I would much rather work a regularly scheduled 60 than a totally unpredictable 40.
And yet I must work all of those hours because I need that money. And of course that brews resentment. Something I think is talked about a lot now that we probably all know is the importance of having multiple streams of income. So you're not relying on any one thing for money. And in my opinion, makes you enjoy those things more because you know that the sole reason you're doing that job is not just to pay the bills. It is actually a little bit that you actually want to, because there are other ways you could be earning money as well. And that just gives it a little bit of edge of enjoyment.
I'm going to push back a little bit. I think a lot of people have subscribed to that notion that you need to have multiple streams of income. Otherwise, if you just have one, it's too fragile. It's not resilient enough if something happens. But there is a trade-off. I think a lot of people just make it sound like it's all good if you have multiple streams of income. but there's added complexity. More importantly, if you focus on one thing and only one thing, you're more likely to succeed at that and do better, such that even if you were to do 3 things and you add those together, your level of success would still be reduced compared to that just doing that one thing really well. Now, I do have multiple streams of income because I have a few projects in medical education that relate to one another, work with one another, but I also do car reviews on the side as a little side hustle hobby. So I'm not saying you shouldn't do this because I do it myself, but I acknowledge that it is actually probably not ideal from what is optimal from a financial perspective. I'm doing it because I'm following my interest. And I love cars. I find that really fun, even if I lose money with every single video. I get excited and feel those warm, buzzy feelings when people reach out to me from the medical education side. So there are benefits, but the idea of you needing to have multiple streams of income just for the sake of having multiple streams of income, I'm going to push back on and say there are definite pros and cons, and we don't talk about the cons enough when it comes to multiple streams.
So what do multiple streams of income look like for me? Well, in my opinion, I don't think it's compatible with a full-time job in medicine. I definitely think some hours need to be dropped to open up more hours for other streams to be developed. Career routes that are very well established in the part-time world, things like general practice, obstetrics and gynecology, pediatrics, there is a bit more of a part-time culture there. With surgery, it is coming, it is talked about more than it ever has been before, but it's by no means particularly well established and will not be easy to achieve from what I'm hearing.
So going back to specialty and level of training, that applies here too when it comes to these side hustles or other streams of income. So I have a buddy who went into anesthesiology. There are other specialties as well. More traditionally, we consider the road specialties the best lifestyle specialties: radiology, ophthalmology, anesthesiology, and dermatology. But I would argue the road specialties has now changed, which is coming out in a future video on this channel, so subscribe. We also are covering similar content on Med School Insiders, so subscribe there too. But again, zooming out a bit, number one, your level of training as a junior doctor or early stage, you are not going to have the level of control of your schedule. You're probably working longer hours than you will as a fully trained attending or consultant. And number two, the specialty. So if you're in surgery, as Surina was mentioning, less likely to have the flexibility in your schedule to have those side hustles versus anesthesiology or psychiatry or some other things. I do find it interesting she mentioned OB-GYN, because in the US, OB-GYN is considered to have a more challenging specialty, but it sounds like on the other side of the pond, it's different.
I hope to be working on my other streams of income from things like this. And as you all know, I've not really been treating it like a job with consistent uploading schedules or having a sort of business mindset around this whole thing. But even so, it could be a financially viable option to serve as another stream of income. Would it allow me to leave medicine with a greater degree of flexibility and more wealth, both in the forms of time and money? Possibly. So
finances of content creation, we have 3 channels: Med School Insiders, this, and Jabal and Cars, around 1.7 million, around 250K, and around 10K at the time of this recording. And honestly, it doesn't pay that well because it depends on how you approach it. If you want to do things yourself, you'll make fine money. But generally speaking, those that are doing many other things, and I do a lot beyond just content creation, you need to have a team to help edit and publish, etc. with the videos. So when you're paying the team, that really eats into the profit margin from your content creation. And even with sponsors and stuff, you want to be very selective with sponsorships and only work with companies that you actually believe in. Otherwise, you water down your whole message and you kind of lose that sense of integrity with yourself and your viewers. So I would argue for most of us, again, if you're a mega influencer, 10 million subscribers, whatever, different story. But for most of us, content creation doesn't pay nearly as well as most people make it seem, because the majority of us who do content creation are these mega influencers. However, I would argue that what is underappreciated about being a content creator are the other opportunities that open up, the other professional opportunities, the other personal opportunities. That, to me, is much more valuable than making 5, 10, 15K per month. Again, a lot of which is going to go towards your team.
Being in medicine is a weird enough experience. There are the body fluids that you have to see and handle, and then there are the incredibly vulnerable moments that you somehow get to be a part of, when people are dealing with some of the most difficult things in their lives.
By the way, some specialties are exposed to a lot more bodily fluids than others, and we cover all that in the So You Want to Be playlist on Medical Insiders.
Assumptions are made that you shouldn't care about the working conditions or the money because, hey, you're doing the job of the people and you are running it on goodwill. Now, I'm not in agreement with this narrative at all. I believe you should have good and safe working conditions.
Great point, Surina. People who say this fall into one of two camps. Number one, they have a vested interest in you working harder, more hours for less money. Let's say they're in administration or whatever. Or number two, and more commonly, virtue signaling, which unfortunately with social media has gotten only more common and is completely insufferable.
There is this constant background rumbling guilt that, yes, I do have a massive student loan debt on my head, which I have to pay back for the pleasure of training as a doctor.
So she did her training in the UK, but my understanding was that their cost of training is really low and that student loan burden is really small. So maybe someone can comment down below. Maybe it's massive, like relatively for them, or maybe she does have a really large student loan burden. And if that's the case, I'm kind of confused because I thought the UK cost of education for medical school for doctors is like an order of magnitude lower than in the US. Because you actually hear that brought up a lot when people discuss the student loan burden in the US and how the doctors here make so much more, therefore they can afford the student loan burden, etc., etc.
I think you should think of yourself as part of a very big world and think about what you can kind of give back, what value you can bring. I believe that purpose can be changing with different periods of your life, that everyone's purpose can be on completely different scales, and that there shouldn't be any hierarchy of one purpose being better or more noble than another.
I agree with that. So purpose, I think, is definitely going to change over the course of your lifetime for many people. And it's not about finding your purpose, it's more about creating your purpose. And it's whatever you deem it to be. There's no right or wrong here. And it's about what feels right to you. And I think what a lot of people get tripped up on is they're in their 20s, they're like, oh, I haven't found my purpose, I don't know what's going on, like, I need to find my purpose. Let it happen. Allow your curiosity to guide you, and eventually you will find something, and you will generate your own purpose. It's not a matter of finding it, it's a matter of following your interests, or your curiosity, or the things you care about, and then over time, as you develop those skill sets and start making more and more of an impact, you start to develop that purpose.
To pursue other things to make a living, like this content creation stuff, I just can't help but think that I am leaving a better purpose for one that's just not as meaningful. And again, I'm not saying that one is better and one is worse. I'm literally just thinking out loud about the things and the niggles that lie in my mind, and maybe lie in other people's minds as well when they're at crossroads like this.
Dude, I can totally relate to that. When I quit, I was very open. Pros and cons to that. And some people were saying, you left this thing, plastic surgery, so noble, so blah, 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 so prestigious, so impactful, and now you're becoming a content creator? And, I mean, you're not going to make everyone happy, so who gives a shit, right? But also, I was like, well, first of all, I'm not just becoming a content creator, but even if I was, that's not necessarily a problem, because you define what your purpose is. And if you want to argue that it's a matter of impact, then one could argue that as a physician, as a traditional physician who is maybe, let's not talk about inventing a medical technology and licensing that and impacting thousands or millions of people, but most physicians, the overwhelming majority of physicians, are interacting and helping one patient at a time, and they're limited by their time because that time doesn't scale. Whereas if you become an entrepreneur, generally speaking, the impact you have can scale. So let's say as a emergency medicine physician, you are actually saving lives occasionally, right? With entrepreneurship, based on your business, oftentimes you're not. But one could argue here, this EM doctor is saving X number of lives per week, and the entrepreneur is not saving any lives, however, is having a smaller magnitude of impact, but on 3 orders of magnitude more people, right? So then it's like, well, who actually has the greater impact? You don't know. Food for thought, but at the end of the day, it's about doing what makes sense to you and what aligns with your values. And oftentimes, these hesitations that we have in our head is often because we're concerned about what other people may think, or we're succumbing to the sunk cost fallacy ourselves. And when you can remove the noise and focus on just your values and what you want and your future life vision, then you get clarity. Things kind of fall into place.
There are a lot of unknowns. I'm currently applying for surgery in the UK, and questions like, will I get a job? If I do, will I hate it? Is the role of content creation still on the hobby side or more of a career side? I don't know. I think all we can do is figure out our values, figure out what the life we want should look like, and then figure out how to get there within that value system. And that is what the journey ahead holds.
Well said. And to add to that, it's okay if those values and priorities change with time, and what you decide now doesn't have to be stuck to for the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years. You can change it at any point for whatever reason you feel, and that's okay. Great video, Surina. My friends, let me know what you think with a comment down below.